it's not censorship because, well, there's not been some prior edict that's banned discussion of certain topics. But what it is something much worse. It's a kind of gangster-style intimidation.
Now, all of a sudden, the left-wing tribe is upset about that, even though that's been going on in the years before and during COVID. So all of this free speech stuff that the left-wingers are bringing up now is completely disingenuous. So there's very few people who defend speech and the free exchange of ideas as a matter of principle left.
The assassin who shot Charlie Kirk was also targeting free speech. He disagreed with the speaker's views, and he thought viciously that by silencing him, he could eliminate threats to his worldview. If there could have been a silver lining to that tragic atrocity, it would have been for political leaders to coalesce around the value of free speech. But in our tribal political atmosphere, that did not happen. The current administration squandered the opportunity and instead decided to go to war with free speech itself by targeting the free speech of critics of the president. The most flagrant example of this, of course, in the last week was what happened to Jimmy Kimmel and ABC. Today, we'll explain how that happened. But it's, of course, worth noting, of course, that critics of the president's actions against Kimmel, who've draped themselves in the mantle of free speech, have themselves endorsed the same kind of tactics the president's now using against his enemies when they have targeted their enemies in the past. What can we make of all of this? Well, that is what we'll discuss on today's episode of the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Ben Bayer, fellow at ARI. With me is Associate Fellow Mike Mazza. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Ben.
So, Mike, I think we should start by just getting clear on what some of the basic facts of the case the past week we've been dealing with are. And the first thing to note, and it's very important, is it all started with a set of comments that Jimmy Kimmel made on his program, talking about the treatment and the discourse around the assassin of Charlie Kirk, Tyler Robinson, by saying that supporters of the president were trying to argue that Robinson was a leftist, when in fact Kimmel suggests that he was himself a member of the MAGA movement. And this, from everything we now know, is false. It was false. That everything points to the fact that Robinson was in fact motivated by leftist ideology. So it is important to get on the table that, in fact, what Kimmel said was false and on certain levels ridiculous, given what we now know.
Yeah, I think it's important to frame Kimmel's comments to understand the level of outrage the kind of people allied with Kirk, MAGA, the president had about it. So at the time Kimmel made the clips, and everything was transpiring so fast, we have to take a moment to put ourselves back in that moment. It wasn't known whether precisely the shooter's motives were, but it wasn't a state of complete ignorance yet. So the kind of information about what had been written on the assassin's shell casings of the assassin's bullets had leaked and strongly suggested a kind of left-wing worldview at play. So Kimmel, in effect, amplified a sort of nascent conspiracy theory that the assassin was actually MAGA, even though the evidence was slowly accumulating in the opposite direction. So I think that's a major reason why there was so much outrage at the Kimmel comments. There's been some kind of pro-Kimmel apologetic saying he was canceled for a joke, and that's not really what was outrageous to people. It was this kind of quasi-conspiracy theory about the assassin being a MAGA person.
Yeah, that is definitely important. Now, for the reasons you've just stated, what happens next in the story, of course, is that the MAGA movement does become outraged. They speak out against what Kimmel said, and in part with the wind of that in his sails, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr goes on a podcast hosted by someone named Benny Johnson And well, rather than summarize it, I think it would be a good idea for us to watch several clips from this interview, because this is where the threats to free speech begin. So let's play the first clip.
This is where it becomes a free speech issue.
Yeah.
So here's the first clip.
When you look at the conduct that has taken place by Jimmy Kimmel, it appears to be some of the sickest conduct possible. As you've indicated, there are avenues here for the FCC. There's a very concerted effort to try to lie to the American people about the nature, as you indicated, of one of the most significant, newsworthy public interest acts that we've seen in a long time. From the moment that I have become chairman of the FCC, I want to reinvigorate the public interest. And what people don't understand is that the broadcasters, and you've gotten this right, are entirely different than people that use other forms of communication. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. There's calls for Kimmel to be fired. I think, you could certainly see a path forward for suspension over this. And again, the FCC is going to have remedies that we could look at.
So I think there's two important things to note about that clip. One is the extensive use Chairman Carr is making of the FCC's public interest standard. We'll have a fair amount to say about that today, but basically the way he's arguing is the fact that Kimmel's saying something false it goes against his conception of the public interest, and that is the kind of regulatory standard of the FCC, and that's what makes it relevant that someone like ABC relies on its broadcast licenses. And so then you get to the line that has now been widely commented on: we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. And the comment that's been widely made, which I think is apt, is that this is textbook Hollywood. This is Hollywood style gangster intimidation language. Nice license you got there. It would be a shame if someone were to take it away.
He'll make ABC an offer they can't refuse. But Ben, now ABC itself doesn't need a license to operate. So what's the real target here?
Well, it does in a number of ways. So to begin with, ABC does own something like 8 different TV stations. It's flagship stations in the major markets, and so it does actually have a license. It's true that the bulk of the affiliates of the network are not owned by the company. They have their own separate licenses, but they, of course, themselves need to keep those licenses, and they can be withdrawn under the pressure of the FCC. And that's why I think it's relevant to look at the second clip.
Again, there's actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters, and frankly, I think that it's really sort of past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on Comcast and Disney and say, listen, we are going to preempt. We are not going to run Kimmel anymore until you straighten this out, because we licensed broadcaster, are running the possibility of fines or license revocations from the FCC if we continue to run content that ends up being a pattern of news distortion. So I think, again, Disney needs to see some change here, but the individual licensed stations that are taking their content, it's time for them to step up and say, this garbage, to the extent that that's what comes down the pipe in the future, isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. But this sort of status quo is obviously not acceptable where we are.
So in the exact same context where he's threatening ABC, he's also basically threatening those affiliates who have licenses other than ABC's. And I actually looked into the timestamps of all the different relevant events here. And so that podcast is posted 7 a.m. on September 17th. I don't think it's a coincidence that around 6 p.m. later that day is when we then get the press release from Nexstar, which is an owner of a large number of ABC affiliates, basically saying they're going to preempt Kimmel unless something happens to Kimmel. And it's also relevant that Nexstar not only has licenses that it needs to do business, but that it has recently entered into an agreement to do a merger with a large number of additional affiliates it wants to make part of its company. And it's been widely noted that the FCC needs to approve that merger. And so a company like Nexstar has a lot at stake, and therefore needs the compliance and needs the approval of the FCC and needs to be on good terms with the FCC. But here's Chairman Carr suggesting we might not be on good terms with you because we don't like what Kimmel said. And it's not just licenses that are at stake. It turns out the FCC has other ways to punish the relevant companies, not just the affiliates, but ABC directly. And here's a point from the same interview that I think has not been as widely discussed. Ankar Gate pointed this out to me, and let's check this one out.
Yeah, I mean, Disney's got a lot of trouble. I mean, look, we've launched, I don't know that we've talked about this publicly yet, but we have launched and are continuing to run a investigation into Disney for their DEI practices for potentially violating the own FCC's equal employment opportunity rules. We've issued Disney a letter of inquiry on that. We've received some documents from them. Again, we haven't talked, I don't think, publicly about that before, but that is a very active investigation that's underway into Disney on that conduct.
So here's another basically blackjack that the federal government, by way of the FCC, holds independently even of its licensing over a company like Disney, which owns ABC, that they can threaten to execute this investigation and prosecute for alleged infractions of some kind of equal employment policy the FCC has, because Disney uses DEI policies, which, by the way, were probably forced on it by the previous administration. And all of this, of course, is in the context of a president who repeatedly attacks the press, and as recently as the end of August put the following tweet on his Truth Social account, where he basically says that he sees the networks which are biased against him. Allegedly, 97% of the stories against him are bad. If this is the case, they are simply an arm of the Democrat Party and should, according to many, have their licenses revoked by the FCC. And so, one of the debates that's, I think, raged throughout social media in the last week is whether or not the Trump or the FCC are engaging in some kind of censorship against ABC. And I think there's an argument you can make that it's not censorship because, well, there's not been some prior edict that's banned discussion of certain topics, and now ABC decided to discuss those topics and now is being punished by the censor. It's not like that. That's the traditional model of censorship. But what it is something much worse. It's a kind of gangster-style intimidation where there are vague threats made, sometimes after the fact, of the alleged speech. That's what's happening here. And now, as a result, the broadcasters, the media personalities, et cetera, are paralyzed, not knowing what's going to happen to them. And I think there's an argument you can make. We'll come back to this. This is worse than traditional censorship.
Yeah, I mean, to underscore the nature of the threat, after people are defending Kimmel, critiquing Trump, then he starts to threaten to pull more licenses, makes more threats, more intimidation tactics. I think we have a clip from the president on just this that we can pull up.
The only time host is on network television, there is a licensing. I'll give you an example. I read someplace that the networks were 97% against me. I get 97% negative. And then 97% against, they give me only bad publicity or press. I mean, they're getting a license. I would think maybe their license should be taken away. It will be up to Brendan Carr. I think Brendan Carr is outstanding. He's a patriot. He loves our country, and he's a tough guy. So we'll have to see.
I mean, what he's saying, the standard is they're against me. That's the complaint he's raising, not even that they are perpetrating lies or hoaxes or something, but that they're against him. And that's the grounds on which he's saying they should lose their license.
Yeah. So, of course, Mike, Kimmel's now been reinstated. The suspension was lifted. And I think some people might be tempted to think, well, no harm, no foul. But what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, reinstated for what reasons? Well, it's on the one hand, the Disney and ABC have the president kind of intimidating them to cancel it, but then on the other hand, there's been pushback against I guess it's Disney's decision from the kind of Democrat left, and so after the reinstatement, Nexstar and the other affiliate network, Sinclair, both have said they're still going to preempt the Kimmel airing, so that Disney and ABC will have the Kimmel show, but many of the affiliate stations won't run it. And now we have elected Democrats calling for Sinclair and Nexstar to be broken apart because of their decision not to air Kimmel. So there's a kind of degree of tribalism on this issue that's mind-boggling. So just for example, Elizabeth Warren outraged that Kimmel was canceled because she thinks of the president and the FCC chairman's threats. But then now that he's reinstated and Nexstar and Sinclair are saying they still won't air him, she and some of her allies are making threats that these stations should be broken apart because they own too much of some market share, that there's a limit on how much market share, how many TV stations can be owned by a single owner. So these kind of companies are being threatened from their free speech is being threatened from every direction, and including by people who just a week earlier were saying their free speech had been violated. So.
Yeah, and as to the no harm, no foul point, I think the harm is still there, not just from the Democrats that you mentioned who are now doing the same thing, but still from the administration. As soon as ABC announced they were going to suspend for the duration of the time that they did, President Trump also tweets on Truth Social saying congratulations to ABC, and then encourages NBC and others to fire other late night hosts who are also critical of him. He mentions Jimmy and Seth. And so it's like the threat's still there. And even if ABC has now reversed their suspension because their fans are upset with it, the threat's still there to them as well. But Mike, we should now, I think, talk about the other aspect of this debate that you've seen break out on social media, where the allegation is, look, this was a decision of a private company, ABC, to fire Kimmel. They were doing it in response to basically market forces because their affiliates were objecting to Kimmel. And therefore, this isn't a free speech issue at all. And I think the first thing to say here is that the people saying this are very often the same people who in the past were, I think, rightly emphasizing over the controversy about Biden and the Twitter files, that the fact that a private company is the one that is making the proximate decision, that does not alter the fact that it could still be a free speech issue because the private company might be responding to a threat from government. That's what we now know was in fact happening over the jawboning that the Biden administration was doing to Twitter during COVID, which we know because
now we know Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, like
doing it to lots of different companies apparently, which only recently come out. And many of these critics, I'm thinking here about Ilya Shapiro in particular, pointed out, no, that's still a violation of their free speech. And I think they were right about it on that issue with Biden versus social media. But that means they should realize that can apply here too. that even if ABC is the one that for at least a while decided to suspend Kimmel, if they're doing it in response to all the different threats that we talked about, the threat to have their license removed, the threat to have them investigated for DEI, equal opportunity, equal employment opportunity violations, the threats against their affiliates, which are likely what motivated their affiliates, both to have their license renewed and also questions of mergers. Well, that means that all the private parties in this case who had a role in the decision had their free speech violated. Now, one of the things that Shapiro argued is, well, we have reason to think they wanted to get rid of Kimmel anyway. His ratings weren't that good. He was losing money. So they used this as an excuse, as an opportunity to finally do what they had always wanted to do, use the morals clause in his contract to boot him out. Now, I think that's at least partially refuted by the fact that they've now reinstated Kimmel. So it's not obvious that they wanted to get rid of him. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Because we're talking here about freedom of speech, and regardless of the motives of the victimizer, the infraction to their freedom comes from the public act by the government here, because freedom means the freedom to say X or Y. That's what freedom means. It means the freedom to make a choice between two options. And if someone says, basically, you're not allowed to say X, even if you don't want to say X, if you're now only allowed to say the very thing you want to say, that is still patently a violation of your freedom. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom to say only one thing. It means the freedom to say a variety of things. And so regardless of the motives of any of the parties concerned here, this is a violation of free speech. The First Amendment says Congress shall not pass any laws abridging the freedom of speech. And this is definitely an abridgment of it.
Yeah, it's I mean, part of the reason that the Shapiro defense has some surface plausibility is that in this case, Nexstar and Sinclair are also known to be kind of conservative leaning. So like, yeah, Kimmel's ratings are down. He's losing money. Also, the owners of these companies are pro-Trump or conservative, or maybe they're genuinely on the side of outrage over what Kimmel said. But at the same time, if you think back to the Biden COVID censorship of the social media companies, like the executives there were probably sympathetic to a lot of yeah, we don't want Joe Rogan talking about various false cures, and we don't want conspiracy theories floating around. Like they probably genuinely believe that, and yet the pressure from the Biden administration is still censorship of them, and like this kind of thing gives this. What are really their motives? Are they really acting out of a threat, or would have they done it anyway? I mean, both they can both be doing it because they agree and because they're being threatened. Like maybe that pushes them over the it's a tipping point. They didn't like the speech. But we have this policy that everybody should, as long as they're not saying anything illegal, these kind of open social network policy, and then along comes the threat, and they said, well, we didn't like this anyway. So there could be multiple motives explaining something, and if one of the motives is that they're under threat, then that is really an act of censorship, even if maybe they would have done it anyway.
Yeah. Ankar Gate and I are writing an article about this right now, and one of the points that he made in the article that I thought was very insightful on this very issue is that one of the reasons that this kind of gangster-style intimidation is more dangerous than traditional censorship is precisely because of the way that it gives this kind of plausible deniability to the person who's violating free speech, to the government, because it does kind of look like the person's voluntarily complying, and then that makes it look like you're not actually violating their free speech, which amounts to a kind of sanction of the victim on the part of the victim of the violation. It is the same reason why when gangsters make their threats. They try to make it look like a gentlemanly agreement, making you an offer you can't refuse. That makes it sound like, oh, I've really persuaded you. But of course, that's not what extortion is, and governments engaging in the same kind of extortion here. It's, for those of you in the audience who've read Atlas Shrugged, this is the same thing that comes up between Reardon and the government when they try to get him to sign the voluntary gift certificate, to sign over the rights to his medal. It's very important to them that it be seen as voluntary, that he actually signs, that they don't just march into his factory and take his formulas. That gives the evil a certain kind of power through its appearance of virtue, and that is one of the things that makes it particularly dangerous. Now, Mike, you raised the issue of the fact that Biden had done similar things to social media companies during COVID. And so that I think that raises a natural question here about how do you compare these two? And we have slightly different takes on this, though I think ultimately they're compatible. And on the question of who's worse here, like which is worse, what Biden did or what Trump did? And the argument I would make for why what Trump is doing is in a way worse is that the fact that he's doing it so publicly, what Biden did privately, I've said before, like we now know that what Biden was doing behind the scenes amounted to the same thing. We didn't know it at the time. We didn't have the documentation. Trump is just putting this all out in the open on his social media platforms and when his commissioner does interviews. And so part of the reason why it's so dangerous is that now it's not just ABC that's being targeted. It's basically anybody, NBC, any network who wants to publicly air criticism of the president. And so the scope of the threat is much wider. And especially when you're using this vague public interest standard that has no real definition, as long as Carr takes takes the president's view and his view to represent what the public interest stands for, it's now a super general threat to all kinds of people.
Yeah, so I think I agree with that much. That is, that invoking the public interest standard through the FCC is a wider threat than what Biden was doing, was much more targeted. But to the question of whether it's better that it's clandestine or out in the open, I think my view is that the kind of clandestine censorship, I think, is worse. So imagine right now we have a lot of people being arrested, detained openly for immigration violations. That's really bad. Now imagine, though, if that was done secretly and publicly being denied that it was done, so that people were just disappearing. And like, okay, maybe your brother knows that you were actually taken by the government, but nobody else knows. So now there's like rumors and fear. Is the government really snatching people up, or is this just some crazy conspiracy theory? And that's kind of the analog to what was going on with COVID. There were people kind of saying, yeah, I think this is in response to government intimidation. And then, well, but there isn't actually any evidence of this. There's rumors, and maybe the rumors started with people who have actual knowledge. But so there's this, is this government censorship, or is this just Facebook's private act, and people are outraged at Facebook and YouTube who are in fact victims? So there's just you're not even in a position to know what exactly is going on and who you should be objecting to or fighting back against, and in what form. So yeah, I mean, the FCC Trump threats are much wider in scope, but at least now we know what's happening, and we don't have to wait 3 years to know what's happening.
I think you're certainly right that the fact that threats can be a matter of innuendo, a matter of speculation on the part of the victim, is part of what makes them bad, insofar as it paralyzes the victims, at least, who have some notion that there might be a threat. And it might be just that these are they're both worse than the other in different respects.
Yeah,
and
I think that's probably right. Yeah.
And but what's I think definitely true, regardless, is both of them, what Biden did to the social media companies and what Trump is now doing to traditional broadcast companies, both of them are worse than traditional censorship. And here it's relevant to share a passage from Ayn Rand's essay, Have Gun, Will Nudge, from March 1962. She's commenting on similar tactics that were enacted by the Kennedy administration, by its FCC commissioner, Newton Minow. And here's the paragraph where she makes the same kind of point we're currently discussing. She says, censorship in its old-fashioned meaning is a government edict that forbids the discussion of some specific subjects or ideas, such as, for instance, sex, religion, or criticism of government officials. An edict enforced by the government's scrutiny of all forms of communication prior to their public release. But for stifling the freedom of men's minds, the modern method is much more potent. It rests on the power of non-objective law. It neither forbids nor permits anything. It never defines or specifies. It merely delivers men's lives, fortunes, careers, ambitions into the arbitrary power of a bureaucrat who can reward or punish at whim. It spares the bureaucrat the troublesome necessity of committing himself to rigid rules, and it places upon the victims of the burden of discovering how to please him with a fluid, unknowable as their only guide. And I think that is exactly what we see happening right now, and it's very scary. And one element of the political situation that I think is now new to the 2020s that we didn't have happening in the early 1960s is just the extent to which these kinds of threats are now weaponized in the act of political tribal warfare. That our political system is tremendously tribalistic in a way that it wasn't even in the 1960s. And Mike, you already spoke to this some, but we should talk about just how both the right and the left are acting tribalistically with regard specifically to the issue of free speech. And so I would start by commenting on the way the right is doing it, and I'll give a couple of anecdotes of it. So, one noteworthy example was when Attorney General Pam Bondi, after Charlie Kirk is assassinated, goes on a podcast September 15th and argues that there's a distinction between free speech and hate speech, and says explicitly that law enforcement should start targeting hate speech. And she says this without any kind of qualification. And that's even though the laws against hate speech, which have traditionally been promulgated and supported by the left, the right would traditionally say about them, no, these are unjustified laws. Hate speech is free speech. You ought to have the right to say hateful things, even if they're hateful. And in response to at least some people on the right criticizing Bondi, she did then kind of walk it back in a post where she says what she meant by it was threats of violence and intimidation. And it's true that you don't have a free speech right to engage in threats of violence, that is not a form of freedom. It's a form of using force that violates someone's freedom. But it's noteworthy that she didn't have any trouble making the point about hate speech without any qualification earlier and had to be corrected. And then even after that walk back, Trump himself is asked about what she said about hate speech, and he doesn't even bother trying to walk it back. He says he basically says, well, maybe we ought to go after hate speech that the networks are engaging in, and accuses the reporter who's asking him the question about what Bondi says as engaging in hate speech. That was one of my anecdotes. The second was an exchange that happened with Christopher Rufo, who's an activist, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And I just want to put on screen here a tweet that he put on X that I think really symbolizes I think it illustrates much of the right's current attitude about this, which is in the background acknowledging, people have objections to the very existence of the FCC, to the fact that it can make these kinds of threats that we've been talking about. And he says, sorry, but the FCC was established by FDR to impose public standards on broadcasters and used by JFK to pressure station managers into dropping right-wing radio programs. All true. The shoe has been on the other foot for almost 100 years. Turnabout is fair play. And he goes on to say maybe you could make an argument for why the FCC should be abolished and the radio waves privatized. But in the meantime, he's happy to play the game that he himself acknowledges the left has been playing viciously for decades. And he's happy to say, let's do to them what they did to us. And to me, that is pure tribalism. That is abandonment of any kind of principle, just using the language of free speech as a weapon against your enemy.
Yeah, from the left, we have a bunch of people who were, quiet during a lot of the outrageous abuses of free speech over the last 10 or so years from the left, all of a sudden discovering the value of free speech and the value of the free exchange of ideas. Obama's suddenly out in support of Jimmy Kimmel's right to speak. Some people were circulating on Twitter an old tweet from the left-wing commentator Matthew Iglesias. A few years ago, some people went to Tucker Carlson's home and were threatening his family. And, as horrible as I think Tucker Carlson is, you don't go and intimidate someone's that's a major violation of his free speech rights. And Iglesias's response to it at the time was that it's not tactically sound, but if you're emphasizing with the fear of Carlson's family rather than the fear of his victims, I don't know what that refers to, then you should take a moment to reflect on why that is. That is if Tucker Carlson's family is being threatened with violence, he had it coming, which is the same thing that some people have been saying about Charlie Kirk and it's just a horrible reaction to have. There's all these now people who have been saying things like that about Charlie Kirk, losing their jobs, getting quote unquote canceled, and now all of a sudden the left-wing tribe is upset about that, even though that's been going on for much more petty things or had been going on in the years before and during COVID. We mentioned Biden versus YouTube, that is a major story that broke during the last week, and I don't see any outrage about that from any kind of Democrat or left-wing type either. So all of this free speech stuff that the left-wingers are bringing up now is completely disingenuous. But then it's one of the things that is not exactly disappointing or surprising, but maybe saddening to see is how many people on the so-called right or libertarian right or moderates who had been advocating for free speech and opposing unjust cancellations the last decade are all just completely about-faced in the span of a week. So there's very few people who defend speech and the free exchange of ideas as a matter of principle left.
Yeah, I think there's an old adage used to describe the attitude here: free speech for me, but not for thee. And generally, that just means a kind of unprincipled hypocrisy about which free speech you defend and which free speech you want to violate. But it is now the hallmark of the tribalist attitude toward free speech on both sides, and it's unfashionable to make comments about how both sides are to blame. But here it's just really true that neither side, at least in large part, I mean, you find exceptions to it here and there, but neither side in large part has a principled commitment to freedom of speech. What they have...
This is evidence that it looks like there's two sides, but in an important way, there's not.
Right. They will invoke free speech when it's convenient. They aren't actually loyal to it as a principle. What they're loyal to is personalities, loyal to the leaders of the respective tribes. But in particular, what you see here is that what really drives them is not even affection for an ostensible principle. It's much more driven by hatred for the other side. Whatever we can do to bash the other side doesn't matter what we're doing to any of our ostensible alleged values. Whatever we can do to oppose the other side in this tribal battle is what matters. And so what is it then that enables them on either side to use the weapon of government to engage in this tribal warfare, which really then amplifies it? Because once government is used against your tribe, now you feel like a victim, and now you want to fight back by whatever means possible. And that's arguably what happened to the right under the Biden administration. They felt put upon by various government actions against various companies and individuals through whatever pressure, or deplatformed. Now they want to do it right back to the right, which is what the kind of thing that Rufo is advertising for. And so what is it that enables them to do this? Well, here's where we have to talk about the long-term political institutions that are allowing them to do this. And the FCC is the main one that I see, that I have in my target here. To the idea that the airwaves are owned publicly, and that is what gives the FCC the right to regulate them according to what they call the public interest standard. And it's relevant that nobody has ever really defined what the public interest is supposed to be. It's unclear how they would ever do it. In practice, what it means in reality is one group is going to get sacrificed to the other that is seen to be the representative of the public. And so here in the current case with Kimmel, his falsehoods are seen as antithetical to the interest of the public, which is grieving the loss of Charlie Kirk. And so that means then in practice that the free speech of one side, of one tribe, is going to be sacrificed in favor of the interests of the other. And so this is a perfect opportunity for weaponization of tribalism, where that public interest standard, where one tribe is seen as the representative of the public, gets to weaponize it against the other.
Yeah, and at this moment in time, there's how many major factions are there in the United States that can claim to speak for the public? There's at least two major ones. Since the idea of the public interest is undefinable, non-objective, each of the tribes can have a kind of pseudo-plausible claim to speak for the public interest when it's in power. And right now it's MAGA in power, and they have their conception of the public interest. But it's not too hard to imagine a kind of left wokey version of Trump doing the same kind of thing. Rumors are AOC is gearing up to jump to higher office as a senator, maybe run for president. Like, so you don't think she'll with, again, the same amount of plausibility be in a position that, well, the public interest is, and then rattle off, whatever grievances are trendy on the left at the time. And yeah, that's the public interest. And she won, if she wins a majority of the votes, like Trump won in 2024, like, can't she speak for the public interest then? And what can you say at that point? Because this isn't a well-defined or definable concept, and this kind of abuse is invited by such a non-objective standard for the FCC to decide what goes on the airwaves.
Yeah, this point that if you don't like the other side and you like the guy who's currently in office, you should think about what happens when the other side gets a hold of the same weapon that your guy is now using, which is very likely to happen unless your guy becomes a dictator, is a really important point to think about when thinking in principle about, how government should actually be run. It's part of the reason why, Rufo's idea, turnabout is fair play, is so devastating, because it offers no plan, it offers no principle by which you're ever going to get out of this cycle of tribal political violence. And this is a point that some of the better commentators have made. There was a good article by the editors of the Free Press making this point, that you should worry about the left having the same power as Trump right now. And it's especially true given, as you've emphasized, Mike, that the non-objective nature of the public interest standard. The Free Press also published a very interesting article by Nick Gillespie on this issue. Gillespie is a commentator I don't always like, but it was a very good article illustrating the history of the FCC's use of the public interest standard and how one administration after another has abused it to its political ends. He talks about, and this is the same thing that Ayn Rand was talking about, how under the Kennedy administration, Kennedy would use the FCC to track anybody he regarded as a critic, as a quote-unquote extremist, who was commenting on any kind of broadcast station, and he used it then as a basis to forcibly interject under the guise of the fairness doctrine. We need to be able to respond to what your quote-unquote extremist critic said. Likewise, he talks about LBJ, and I didn't know this before, but apparently President Johnson used his control of the FCC to basically amass a personal fortune because his wife owned a TV station here in Austin, KTBC, and for many years was the only TV station in Austin. He basically refused to let anybody else have a license, which was his purview and his privilege as president controlling the FCC. Likewise, any stations that were critical of Vietnam, of the Vietnam War that he was running, had trouble having their license renewed. Interestingly, one of the things that Gillespie does in this article, he quotes a Clemson professor who's a scholar of this history, who notes that the public interest standard, quote, was a standard that satisfied the courts that the government couldn't act with total impunity, but gave lawmakers the greatest scope possible to interfere. And sounds like if you look at the history of how the FCC has been run, is currently being run, that turns out to be true. And so, Mike, what's the solution to this in the long run? If this is weaponized like this.
One thing to say, especially against somebody like Russo, is this is a case where the way to win the game is not to play. That is, there's nothing that says you have to use all your political capital, and Trump still has some left, I guess, to further ratchet things up, as opposed to use that capital to wind things down. And in terms of like more concrete solutions, so Ayn Rand had a solution to all this that she articulates in her essay, the property status of the airwaves. Am I getting the title right? Yeah, the property status of the airwaves, in which she advocates that the electromagnetic spectra should be there should be ownership claims to it, property rights to the a specific spectra and a geographical area to be worked out the details. That's one solution. So then it's just this spectra in this region is one company's property. They can sell it or lease it or whatever. Now, barring that, a kind of intermediate solution might be something like just completely content neutral licensing. So auctioning off unused spectra to the highest bidder, and then letting companies or people trade licenses, transfer, sell. That's a kind of quasi property-ish rights. That would still involve the government, the FCC, and et cetera, but it would be far superior to the current situation, though I don't think it ultimately is a permanent solution. It would be certainly an improvement, and something that's probably politically possible if there were a president with the will to kind of push in that direction.
Yes, and I suspect that what someone like Rufo would say is, well, that the privatization effort that you mentioned, that's the pie in the sky long-term solution that we don't have time to muster the political will for right now. I would question that. Like, Mike, you've written a lot about recent efforts of privatizing various space exploration operations, something that people thought was impossible, but in fact, through having the right kind of the right kind of laws being passed, is actually something that's happened just in the last 10, 20 years. So there's more that's possible here than people imagine.
I mean, the problem with that as something we could imagine happening in the short term is you'd have to work out all the details of the property rights, and not a lot of legal thinkers think in terms of property rights anymore. So there's like the implementation, I think, is an important part of actually making it a political reality. And so like that's where I think we should aim. But I think in terms of just dialing things back and carving out more consistent free speech rights, I think in the short term, anyway, this is a debate we could only have if there were actually somebody willing to do any of it, and there's not.
What's definitely possible to do in the short term is to just decide that as long as the FCC does exist, and as long as it's supposed to govern according to quote unquote public interest, that be totally tailored to be content neutral, which is what the actual law on the books actually says. It all says that regardless of what powers the FCC has, the First Amendment comes first. And so just as an indication of this, the part of what came up in that interview with Brendan Carr was reference to the fact that maybe you could interpret what Kimmel was doing as a broadcast hoax or as news distortion. There is language in FCC regulations and bylaws about how those are not allowed. But actually, if you look at the actual text of those regulations, in particular the one about hoaxes, you'll note it doesn't actually prohibit just saying any old thing that's false or might be counted as a hoax. It says you can only prohibit broadcast hoaxes where engaging in the hoax could cause immediately damaging immediate damage to lives and property, and where you knew it was going to happen. And this came up basically as a result of the War of the Worlds broadcast, where some people ran out in the streets because they thought there was an alien invasion happening, and that's like arguably a better regulation, because you are actually inciting a disaster to happen if you're telling people that there's an alien invasion, or if you're telling people that lies about real people that could cause them to go out in the immediate moment and start some violence. So that is a content neutral policy. Likewise with the issue of news distortion. What the FCC regulation says about this is that it is at odds with the public interest. But in the exact same text, it immediately says, nonetheless, the FCC must respect the First Amendment. And that always comes first and trumps any considerations about news distortion. And you have a First Amendment right to say false things when it's not any kind of immediate incitement to violence. And so what we have is a set of legal requirements that are currently trying to be content neutral. All that needs to happen is for that to be enforced. Now, what's true is that as long as that public interest standard is in there, there is a contradiction in the laws as they are currently encoded. There's pressure to eat away at the First Amendment when the idea is, well, but whatever this person is saying is at odds with particular tribe's conception of the public interest. And as long as that's there's a contradiction, and that contradiction has to be resolved one way or the other. And it's either going to be resolved by removing that standard, the public interest standard, which means ultimately getting rid of the FCC and privatizing the airwaves, or it's going to be resolved by the erosion of the First Amendment. And I think Americans who believe in freedom and who believe in the Constitution and who care about the First Amendment, well, that's your reason to not want to engage further in the kind of tribal political warfare that the current administration is engaging in, and to do whatever you can to fight against this kind of public interest regulation that the FCC is engaging in to protect the First Amendment. So we should wrap up, Mike. And I think one thing to do here is to share some resources, some of the things we've already mentioned in our conversation today that our audience will be interested to look at if they want to learn more about some of the ideas we've talked about. Let's start first with that essay by Ayn Rand, where she compares traditional censorship to the kind of veiled intimidation that we are now seeing today, the modern style of the infringement on the freedom of speech. This is her essay, Have Gun Will Nudge. It appears in the Objectivist newsletter, March 1962. We have a version of it online you can look at, or you can order yourself a copy of that bound volume of the Objectivist newsletter. We also mentioned her essay, Property Status of the Airwaves. That is not online, but you can read it if you get a copy of her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, where she explains why abolishing the FCC, privatizing the airwaves is the act that would be most consistent with laissez-faire capitalism, with practice of free markets and free minds. Next, a book that our scholars have contributed a lot to. This is the First Amendment, Essays on the Imperative of Intellectual Freedom. There's essays in there by Tara Smith, Ankur Ghate, Ilan Giorno, and Greg Salmieri. And we have put one of the essays from that book online. Greg Salmieri's very theoretical, high-level essay, Free Speech as a Right and a Way of Life. And Greg, in this essay, goes through a lot of the different conceptual distinctions that we talked about today, and what it means to for a government to respect and protect free speech rights, and what it means in our daily lives to practice respect for free speech and the kind of ethos that goes with it. So hope people take a look at those resources. And
yeah, Ben, can I say on the last one,
sure.
We can't, in a certain respect, we can't expect people to come to the defense of free speech unless they understand it as a right and as a value. And I think especially Greg's but the essays in the book throughout really articulate that well. So one thing we can do to fight back is try to spread greater understanding of the right to free speech, and this book goes to that.
Yes, and one way you can do that is to share this episode. If you value free speech, speak up for it. Share what we're doing to speak up for it on social media, which is a place where free speech has been a contentious issue in recent weeks. So subscribe, comment, share, like, retweet, and as always, send your comments and questions to newideal@aynrand.org. Thanks for having this discussion with me, Mike.
Thanks, Ben.